I'm Wolf Blitzer reporting from Washington. We begin with Iraq and the first wave of U.S. military advisors getting ready to work today. They'll start making assessments on Iraqi military strength and the movements of militant fighters north of Baghdad. Last week, President Obama promised to send as many as 300 advisors, military advisors, to Iraq. Meanwhile, the Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki addressed the nation today, telling the Iraqi people the new parliament would help form a coalition government. But he firmly rejected calls for an immediate emergency government.
It is no secret to all Iraqis the dangerous goal behind the call for the formation of a national salvation government, as they call it. It is simply an attempt by those who rebel against the Constitution to end the young democratic process and confiscate the opinions of the voters and circumvent the constitutional merits. The call for the formation of a national salvation government is a coup against the Constitution and the political process.
And in western Iraq, Syria is now being blamed for launching airstrikes in the Anbar province near the Iraq-Syria border. Officials there say more than 50 Iraqi civilians, including a lot of women and children, were killed. For more on those Syrian airstrikes against ISIS targets in Iraq, let's bring in our senior international correspondent, Arwa Damon. She's joining us from Erbil in northern Iraq. Arwa, what can you tell us about this Syrian attack inside Iraq?
Wolf, CNN spoke to the head of the Anbar Governing Council, the provincial council, who said that the Syrian Air Force struck at least 3 locations inside Iraq, all of them along the Iraqi-Syrian border. The vast majority of casualties were civilians. We spoke to an eyewitness, a resident of one of those areas, the town of Al-Qaim. He described how he says they saw the first plane flying overhead. They were very surprised because they had been watching airstrikes happening on the Syrian side of the border for a few days. Very surprised when that plane, he says, flew over into Iraqi airspace, launching one attack. The first, he says, struck an area where refugees from the Iraqi city of Fallujah had fled to. The second airstrike happening inside a fairly busy marketplace. Now, all of this is also interesting, Wolf, because the Syrian government for quite some time now has known exactly where ISIS positions inside Syria have been, and yet for the last few months its response to them, its actions against those ISIS positions within its own borders has been fairly negligible. But what we have been seeing over the last week is an intensified effort by the Syrian regime to launch multiple airstrikes against ISIS strongholds, especially focusing on their headquarters, and that is the city of Raqqa. All of this coming about perhaps because of the strength that ISIS has been garnering inside Iraq, concerns perhaps with all of the military equipment that ISIS has reportedly been moving into the Syrian battlefield. But it seems that what we're seeing right now is the interconnectivity of these two battlefields growing even more. What we are unclear of at this stage is how much coordination there has been between Damascus and Baghdad when it comes to these most recent airstrikes. But again, we are seeing the seemingly intensified effort by the Assad regime to go after ISIS targets inside Syria, but also across the border in Iraq. Wolf.
Very quickly, Arwa, the reaction among Iraqis to these reports that as many as 50 Iraqi civilians were killed, women and children, and many, many more were injured in these Syrian airstrikes. There must be outrage.
There's outrage, Wolf. There's horror. There's desperation. This eyewitness I spoke to is someone who I've known for quite a few years, who we're not naming out of concerns for his own security. But he was describing how he went to the marketplace, and he was saying, you know, you can't imagine what I saw there. There were women, there were children. Some of them were missing limbs. He then went on to the hospital in Al-Qaim and described even more horrific scenes. In fact, he went so far as to say, and he knows this very well firsthand, that when the Americans would bomb Al-Qaim and Husayba, which they did on numerous occasions, he said that their strikes were much more targeted. This bombing by the Syrian regime he described as being completely indiscriminate, seemingly a deliberate effort to target the civilian population, Wolf.
Pretty outrageous when you think about it. All right, thanks very much, Arwa, for that. Let's go back to the comments now by the Prime Minister, Nouri al-Maliki, apparently rejecting any notion of an emergency government in Baghdad. Let's bring in our senior international correspondent, Nick Robertson. He's in the Iraqi capital. Nick, the Secretary of State, John Kerry, was there earlier this week. He had intensive talks with Nouri al-Maliki about creating some sort of more unified government. So here's the question. Is this a direct rebuff from Nouri al-Maliki to John Kerry.
Well, it's certainly repositioning the Prime Minister a little bit here. I mean, the government of national salvation is a little bit different to saying what he said to Secretary of State John Kerry, that he was committed to forming along constitutional lines a government of unity that respected the aspirations of all Iraqis. What he is pushing off is saying that he doesn't want, an emergency government to be put in place, which some people are calling for. He says that's effectively a coup against the Constitution. But more broadly, he wasn't striking a very conciliatory tone. He was going back to what he's been saying over the past couple of weeks, that the rise and the movement of ISIS here has been part of a conspiracy by not only the Sunnis, he didn't say it directly, and the Kurds, because he thinks they've conspired with ISIS to allow them to move so quickly across the country. So it's not the kind of reach out across the sectarian and ethnic divide that really Secretary of State John Kerry had hoped for. What he might have hoped was some words from the Prime Minister saying that, we need to work across all boundaries. I'm ready to reach out. We're ready to make compromises. But that wasn't the language today. It still had very sectarian overtones, Wolf.
So the new Iraqi parliament is supposed to convene, July 1st? Basically, where do we go from here?
Yeah, you have July 1st, it convenes, they determine who will be the speaker, then the Constitution says 30 days to nominate a president, then 15 days to nominate a prime minister, and then another 30 days for that prime minister has to form a government. However, having said that, it could be done faster, but the track record here is in Iraq that it can take months and months and months, go way beyond what the Constitution allows. And what Secretary of State Kerry made very clear when he was here, that there is a real immediate threat and an existential threat to Iraq, and the politicians have to grasp that issue now. Every day that ISIS gets a chance in Iraq to get stronger, it's going to be so much harder to force them out. That's the threat and the danger, and again, the language from the Prime Minister didn't really encourage anyone to believe that that sort of thing was going to happen quickly, Wolf.
There were not a whole lot of high expectations to begin with as far as Nouri al-Maliki is concerned. Nick, thanks very much. Nick Robertson in Baghdad. Last week, President Obama announced that as many as 300 U.S. military advisors would be heading to Iraq. Right now, the first wave of those advisors, that wave getting ready to start some work. Let's bring in our Pentagon correspondent, Barbara Starr. What's the latest? These military advisors, I assume they all wear boots. They are on the ground. What are they doing?
Well, Wolf, about 130 of them on the ground, about another 50 on their way in the coming days. Their first job will be to assess Iraqi forces, assess the ISIS forces, see what everybody's got, what the state of play is on the ground, the strengths and weaknesses on both sides, and report back to the Pentagon. The idea is that they will determine what the U.S. might be able to do to help the Iraqis get back in the fight. But if you want to assess ISIS, that assessment pretty much is already done. According to the U.S. intelligence community, the fighters, there are about 10,000 of them now, Wolf, across the borders between Syria and Iraq. You heard Arwa talking about how we're seeing airstrikes across the border. Maybe about 7,000 ISIS on the Syrian side, still 3,000 on the Iraqi side. What the big concern is for these U.S. military advisors is to get a sense of the situation in Baghdad. Could ISIS make that run for Baghdad? Do they have the manpower and the weapons to do it? Right now, they are very stretched out across northern and western Iraq. But the goal is, the military goal right now, is to certainly make sure they can't get to Baghdad. Wolf?
All right, Barbara, thanks very much. Barbara's at the Pentagon watching what's going on. So U.S. officials certainly would like to see Iraq moving toward a more inclusive government, but there are a lot of experts out there who think that is no longer possible. In fact, some are suggesting a partitioned or divided Iraq could be even more sustainable in the long run. We'll take a look at the possibility of a so-called three-state solution. And later, the establishment strikes back. The sequel. Mainstream Republicans win some high-profile races, what that means for the crucial midterm elections in November and beyond.